Our passage for this lesson is Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 16, the vision of Messiah, part 2. Let me read our passage for today, Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 16. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it has been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. What a glorious vision of the exalted Messiah. And in this lesson, we will finish up our study of this incredible vision of Christ. And so last lesson, we discussed the central attribute of Messiah in verses 12 through 13. And that central attribute is the portrayal of the resurrected Messiah as the great high priest of the heavenly sanctuary. He tends the 7 lampstands in the heavenly temple as a great Melchizedekian high priest, tending the lampstands that represent the remnant of Israel. And so the central attribute, we see Messiah as the great high priest of the heavenly sanctuary. Next, we discussed the bodily appearance of Messiah in verses 14 through 15. And there were many allusions to various end times prophetic passages in the Hebrew Scriptures. But the one that I focused on especially was Daniel chapter 10, verses 5 through 6, the heavenly messenger. And we overviewed why that heavenly messenger was so significant as the source and mediator of Daniel's final end times apocalyptic vision of the great tribulation of Israel's final suffering and judgment, and then her final restoration. And so as the messenger and the heavenly figure of this great final apocalyptic vision of Daniel chapter 10, verse 12, John echoes that heavenly messenger figure and identifies him as the Messiah in his description of his bodily appearance. Finally, today then, we will finish up this vision with the preeminence of the Messiah in Revelation 1:16. The preeminence of Messiah in Revelation 1:16. Let me read this verse one more time for us. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. Now, there is a cluster of Old Testament imagery in that single verse alone. And so we'll comment on the main source text, but I want to especially focus in this lesson on the face like the sun, the face of the exalted Messiah that shone like the sun in its strength. We'll elaborate upon that a bit towards the end of the lesson. But first, let's discuss this first phrase in verse 16. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. Now, in verse 20 later, the apostle will explain that these 7 stars are the angels or messengers of the 7 churches. And in previous lessons, we discussed how the 7 spirits of God represented the 7 archangels, or the highest ranking members of the divine or heavenly council. And so these 7 stars then perhaps represent this heavenly council. And so the description of the exalted high priestly Messiah holding these 7 stars is a vivid expression of his sovereign lordship over even the divine council, the heavenly council. Thus, this description emphasizes the Messiah's possession of and absolute authority over all angelic beings, and indeed the heavenly council, even the highest ranking members of that angelic council. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 1, we read, "To the angel of the church in Sardis write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this." So there they are parallel, they are equated, associated. And in Job 38, verse 7, it will describe the stars of heaven crying out in angelic praise of the Creator God. And so these stars of heaven, these stars of God, this language of angelic heavenly beings, again, is used by John the Apostle here, and it describes the Messiah's supreme lordship as the Son of Man. He possesses in his hand, in the palm of his hand, he exerts sovereign authority and control and lordship even over the heavenly council and the host of heaven. Next in Revelation 1:16b, "And out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword." The Old Testament background for this messianic description is Isaiah 11, verse 4, and Isaiah 49, verse 2. In Isaiah 11:4, we read, quote, "But with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked." In Isaiah's vision of the Davidic Messiah in Isaiah 11, 1 through 5, the Davidic king does not conquer through conventional weapons or militaries, but through the irresistible power of his spoken judgment alone. Revelation repeatedly echoes this text, just as the Messiah in Isaiah, the shoot or the descendant of Jesse, destroys the wicked by his very word. In Revelation, he will defeat all his enemies with the sword of his mouth that comes out of his mouth. Revelation 2:16, 19, verse 15, and verse 21. Also, this imagery evokes Isaiah 49, verse 2, quote, "He made my mouth like a sharp sword." The servant of Yahweh here is depicted as possessing a divinely empowered word that accomplishes the purposes of God among the Gentile nations. Revelation thus merges the royal messianic imagery from Isaiah 11 with the suffering servant imagery from Isaiah 49. The Messiah's mouth itself becomes the weapon of God. And this image is paralleled in other Old Testament passages like Hosea 6:5. "I have slain them by the words of my mouth." The sword imagery in Revelation 1:16 then also belongs to the broader Old Testament divine warrior tradition, in which Yahweh, the divine warrior general king of Israel, defeats all of his enemies through his mere command. Listen to Isaiah 30. In Isaiah 30, verses 31 through 33. Isaiah 30, 31 through 33. "For at the voice of the Lord, Assyria will be terrified when he strikes with the rod. And every blow of the rod of punishment which the Lord will lay on him will be with the music of tambourines and lyres, and in battles, brandishing weapons, he will fight them. For Topheth has long been ready. Indeed, it has been prepared for the king. He has made it deep and large, a pyre of fire with plenty of wood, the breath of the Lord, like a torrent of brimstone sets it afire. And also then in passages like Isaiah 66, verse 16, Isaiah 66, 16, for Yahweh will execute judgment by fire and by his sword on all flesh, and those slain by the Lord will be many. So this sword of Yahweh, this divine warrior general, divine warrior tradition, is also part of this sword imagery that comes forth from the mouth of Messiah. Next, in Revelation 1:16, we read, quote, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. Perhaps one of the most beautiful descriptions of the exalted Messiah. The Apostle John experienced, of course, firsthand the transfiguration of the Messiah in Matthew 17, verse 2, quote, his face shone like the sun, which was an anticipatory glimpse of the full glory to come at Messiah's return and kingdom. Both scenes in Matthew 17 and Revelation 1 reveal Messiah's exalted glory through imagery rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures. Thus, the permanent exalted state of Messiah in Revelation was foreshadowed at the Transfiguration. Now, the sharp sword imagery of the preceding clause already pointed to the servant of Yahweh in Isaiah 49:2. Remember, he made my mouth like a sharp sword. If the Apostle John is already drawing from Isaiah 49:2 for this sword imagery, it is possible, or perhaps likely, that he is also simultaneously invoking the broader portrait of the servant of Yahweh from the same chapter. The servant of Yahweh, whose mission is to restore Israel and illuminate, give light to the nations who are lost in darkness. Isaiah 49, 5 through 6. Listen to you, Isaiah 49, verses 5 through 6, in that same context. Isaiah 49, 5. And now, says Yahweh, who formed me, the suffering servant, from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of Yahweh, and my God is my strength. He says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. There then, in that same servant of Yahweh imagery, that same context, we see John using both motifs. In the first two servant songs of Isaiah, the prophet records, quote, I will give you, the suffering servant of Yahweh, as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, Isaiah 42, verse 6, and, quote, I will make you as a light for the nations, Isaiah 49, verse 6. Remember early in Isaiah 49, verse 2, God will make the suffering servant, quote, he has made my mouth like a sharp sword. So we see that same imagery there. The suffering servant in Isaiah is repeatedly associated with divine light that brings salvation and revelation and the law of God, the light of God's law, to the Gentile nations. He, the suffering servant, will be the bearer and mediator of the light of the glory of God to the world. An even more intriguing connection occurs in Isaiah 60, where the restoration imagery associated with Zion is grounded in the radiance of the glory of God himself. Isaiah 60, verse 2, quote, Yahweh will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. Isaiah 60, verses 19 through 20, quote, Yahweh will be your everlasting light. because the servant in Isaiah functions as the agent through whom this eschatological light reaches the nations. Isaiah 42 verse 6, Isaiah 49 verse 6. The Apostle John could readily associate Isaiah's servant imagery with the radiant glory of the presence of God. The description of Messiah's face, like the sun in Revelation 1:16, is also similar to Judges chapter 5, verse 31, where the song of Deborah and Barak describes those who love Yahweh, the victorious righteous. In Judges 5:31, quote, "Thus let all your enemies perish, O Yahweh, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might or strength." And so that clause there, that ending clause, is remarkably similar to the description in Revelation 1:16. The righteous victors who are aligned with Yahweh, the God of Israel, are compared to the sun at its full strength. John's wording, quote, "the sun shining in its power or strength," closely resembles this very text, Judges 5:31. In Revelation, Messiah is the ultimate righteous victor whose glory eclipses all earthly powers. Now, this face like the sun also evokes Moses' radiant face. If you'll recall, after encountering God on Sinai, Moses' face shone with reflected glory in Exodus 34, 29 through 35. The radiance of the face of Moses demonstrated that Moses had entered the presence of God and mediated his revelation, his law, Torah, to the people. The glory of Messiah's face in Revelation 1:16 exceeds that of Moses. Moses reflected the glory of God. Messiah possesses and radiates it in full strength inherently, as we read in Hebrews 1:3. And so Messiah then is the greater, ultimate covenant mediator, the prophet like Moses. And while Moses mediated the law, Messiah is himself the source and embodiment of the Torah and the revelation of God. This imagery of Messiah's face like the sun also evokes the theme of the glory of God itself in general throughout the Hebrew Bible. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, overwhelming brightness is a characteristic of the visible glory or kavod of Yahweh. In Exodus 24, 16 through 17, God's glory appears as a consuming fire. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, the divine throne vision is surrounded by effulgent, dazzling brightness. In Daniel 7, verse 9, the Ancient of Days appears in radiant splendor. In Psalm 84:11, quote, "Yahweh God is a sun and shield." The Apostle John's description thus identifies Yeshua with these manifestations of the glory of the presence of Yahweh as the very source and embodiment of the glory of God itself. Also, the face like the sun of Messiah in Revelation 1:16 also evokes again the heavenly messenger of Daniel chapter 10, verses 5 through 6. Revelation 1:12 through 16, as we've seen, is already heavily dependent on the heavenly figure of Daniel 10, 5 through 6. And here in Daniel 10, 5 through 6, it describes the heavenly figure, quote, "His face was like the appearance of lightning," end quote. John then expands Daniel's imagery. Lightning and the blazing sun both communicate overwhelming heavenly brilliance. The radiant face of Yeshua identifies him with the exalted heavenly messenger of Daniel 10, 5 through 6, the mediator and revealer, source of Daniel's final apocalyptic vision of the restoration of God's kingdom. Finally, in Daniel 12, verse 3, we see Israel's eschatological glorification. Daniel's resurrection vision states, quote, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above." Daniel 12, verse 3. The righteous will receive glorified radiance in the age to come. Revelation 1:16 presents Messiah as the source and archetype of that eschatological glorification. The glorification that all the saints of Israel will experience in this resurrection originates from the fullness of the glory of the resurrected Messiah himself. Quote, "the firstborn from the dead," end quote. Revelation 1, verse 5. In conclusion, then, taking a big step back and taking a large picture of this grand vision of the exalted Messiah in Revelation 1, 12 through 16, we can make a large theological conclusion. Therefore, the cumulative theological effect of all the Old Testament allusions in the vision of Messiah in Revelation 1, 12 through 16 is to portray the risen Yeshua as the Son of Man of Daniel 7, 13 through 14, as the heavenly messenger and final mediator of Israel's restoration of Daniel 10, 5 through 6, as the Davidic ruler of Isaiah 11, 1 through 5, and as the suffering servant of Yahweh in Isaiah 42 and 59, and Isaiah 50 and 53 and 61. This preeminent Son of Man stands in the midst of the eschatological remnant of Israel, the 7 lampstands, as their heavenly high priest, Davidic ruler, as their divine warrior, and as their covenant judge, ready to initiate the climactic day of Yahweh judgment that will both purify and restore Israel. What an ineffable, sublime, beautiful opening vision, overarching thematic vision of the resurrected, exalted, heavenly high priest, our Messiah. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you next lesson.